At dawn on November 19, 1944, outside a French village called Bougaltroff, a wounded American tank commander refused an order to withdraw from a position his own captain had already decided was too dangerous to hold. His leg had already been gashed to the bone by a landmine 3 days earlier, the wound left essentially untreated in the field. He'd refused morphine, refused evacuation, and stayed in command of his platoon anyway. Now, with German tank destroyers and anti-tank guns opening up from concealed positions across a frozen field, his own captain ordered the company to pull back and take cover. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers radioed back that he'd spotted the enemy guns, and he and his crew were going to fight them instead. Minutes later, 2 direct hits ended his life. It would take 53 years for the United States government to officially recognize what he'd done in those final minutes. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, and the war they fought on 2 fronts at once. In 1942, when the 761st Tank Battalion was activated at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the U.S. military establishment still operated on an assumption that had shaped American military policy since the First World War: that black soldiers, whatever their individual courage, simply weren't suited for combat roles requiring the technical skill and independent judgment demanded of armored warfare. One senior officer, reflecting on his own experience commanding black troops in the previous war, had gone so far as to describe black soldiers as second-class material, fit only for support duty, a view that, however offensive it reads today, reflected the mainstream thinking inside the War Department at the time. That assumption relegated the vast majority of black servicemen to support and service roles: cooks, stevedores, truck drivers, regardless of ability or ambition. In 1940, only 5 black officers held commissions in the entire U.S. Army, and 3 of those were chaplains. The 761st existed specifically to test that assumption, training for nearly 2 years, first in Louisiana and then at Camp Hood in Texas, deep in the segregated Jim Crow South, far longer than most white armored units received before deployment. A delay driven at least in part by senior commanders' reluctance to actually commit the unit to combat, even after training reports repeatedly rated the battalion ready. Among the men who passed through the battalion during this stretch was a young lieutenant named Jack Roosevelt Robinson, the same man who would break Major League Baseball's color line 3 years later, whose military career took a different turn entirely when he refused an order to move to the back of a segregated bus at Camp Hood in 1944. He was court-martialed, ultimately acquitted of all charges, but the incident cost him his place in the unit. He never deployed to combat with the Black Panthers at all. By mid-1944, after a special review that rated the battalion superior and officially combat-ready, the 761st finally received orders for overseas deployment, arriving in England in September and landing at Omaha Beach in France that October. 6 white officers, 30 black officers, and 676 black enlisted men assigned at General George Patton's own request to his Third Army. Patton had reportedly demanded tankers, without specifying race, only to be told the only available reinforcement unit was black. According to accounts of the exchange, he brushed off the objection immediately, more interested in getting trained tank crews to the front than in maintaining segregationist preferences at a moment when he badly needed reinforcements. Patton greeted the battalion with a speech that has been quoted in nearly every account of the unit ever since. He told them plainly they were the first black tankers to fight in the American Army, that he wouldn't have asked for them if they weren't good, and that he expected great things from them, not just for the Army, but, as he put it, for their race watching them from home. It was, by any measure, a rousing send-off, delivered in Patton's characteristically profane, motivational style. It was also, historians have noted since, delivered by a man who privately held the same doubts about black combat troops that most white officers of his era did, the grandson of a Confederate general, and who had been reluctant to commit the battalion to combat at all before manpower shortages left him little practical choice. The Black Panthers got their answer to those doubts almost immediately. On November 7th and 8th, 1944, the battalion entered combat for the first time, attached to the 26th Infantry Division and pushing toward the German-held towns of Vic-sur-Seine and Moyenvic as part of Patton's drive toward the Siegfried Line. German defenders had blocked the narrow approach roads with felled trees and mines, stalling the advance under artillery fire. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, commanding the lead tank of Able Company, dismounted under direct enemy fire, hooked a cable from his Sherman to the roadblock, climbed back in, and simply pulled the obstacle off the road himself. It was reckless, effective, and exactly the kind of initiative that would define his brief combat career. It earned him the first Silver Star, awarded to anyone in the 761st. Rivers didn't stop there, even as his own body kept paying the price for it. On November 16th, as the battalion fought its way into the town of Gebling, his tank struck a landmine at a railroad crossing, tearing a gash in his leg down to the bone. His company commander told him plainly that he was going back to the aid station. Rivers refused. He declined morphine on the grounds that it would dull his judgment, stayed in command of his tank, and continued directing his platoon's fire on German positions outside the town for the rest of that day and the days that followed, his leg wound going essentially untreated and steadily worsening. By the morning of November 19th, that untreated wound had become seriously infected, and Rivers could barely walk without assistance. It didn't stop him from commanding his tank into the attack on Bougaltroff regardless, insisting he was fit enough to lead his platoon. As Company A advanced at dawn through cold, sleet-crusted fields, German Jagdtiger tank destroyers, among the heaviest armored vehicles fielded by any army in the entire war, mounting guns powerful enough to destroy a Sherman with a single hit, opened fire from concealed positions along a tree line, supported by additional anti-tank guns dug in on the far side of a slope, catching the column in the open with almost no cover to maneuver behind. 2 tanks were knocked out almost immediately, killing their crews. Captain David Williams, watching his company take fire from a threat his men could barely see through the morning fog, ordered a withdrawal to save what remained of the unit. Rivers came back over the radio instead, reporting that he'd spotted exactly where the German guns were positioned, and that rather than pull back, he intended to engage them directly to give the rest of his trapped company a chance to escape. He held that position and kept firing until German gunners, at a range of roughly 200 yards, put 2 high-explosive rounds directly into his tank in quick succession. He was killed instantly, the fearless, daring leader his own men had already come to depend on, gone in the space of a few seconds. 4 days later, Captain Williams sat down and wrote a report recommending Rivers for the Medal of Honor, describing his fighting spirit and leadership as an inspiration to the entire unit and language that exemplified the highest traditions of military service. Williams reportedly suspected, even as he wrote it, that the Army's unwritten wartime practice of denying the nation's highest military honor to any black servicemen, a pattern so consistent that not a single black soldier received the Medal of Honor for actions during the entire Second World War at the time it was actually being fought, would mean his recommendation went nowhere regardless of how deserving it was. He was right. Rivers received only a posthumous Purple Heart at the time, his recommendation filed away and effectively forgotten by an institution with no apparent intention of revisiting it. His Medal of Honor recommendation sat unresolved for decades until a 1990s Army-commissioned review of racial disparities in how Medal of Honor recommendations had been handled during the Second World War. Prompted by growing public and congressional pressure to correct a decades-old injustice, finally reopened dozens of cases like his. In 1997, 53 years after Rivers died outside Bougaltroff, he was formally awarded the Medal of Honor, one of 7 black veterans of the war recognized in that same review The vast majority of them, like Rivers, awarded the honor posthumously because so much time had passed that almost none of them lived to see it. Only one recipient from that ceremony, Vernon Baker, was still alive to accept his medal in person. Rivers wasn't the only man in the battalion whose actions that autumn stood out. Days earlier, when Sergeant Warren Creasy's tank was knocked out by a German anti-tank gun, Creasy climbed out under fire, took command of a machine gun mounted on a nearby half-track, and used it to wipe out the enemy gun crew that had just destroyed his own tank. The kind of individual initiative that, again and again, characterized how the 761st actually fought. The battalion's combat record only grew from there, campaign after campaign, with barely a pause to rest or refit between engagements. The Black Panthers fought through the brutal winter weeks of the Battle of the Bulge that December, helped breach the Siegfried Line, and opened the path for the U.S. 4th Armored Division's drive deeper into Germany. Over the following months, the unit smashed through dozens of German towns and cities in a rapid advance across the collapsing Reich, eventually becoming one of the first American units to reach the town of Steyr, Austria, on the Enns River, where they linked up with Soviet troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front advancing from the opposite direction. On May 4, 1945, alongside the 71st Infantry Division, the 761st helped liberate the Gunskirchen concentration camp, a sub-camp of the Mauthausen system, arriving to find the German guards had already fled ahead of them. In total, the battalion spent 183 consecutive days in combat, a record no other American unit matched in the entire war, fought across 6 European countries without a single extended rest. The cost of those 183 days was steep. 3 officers and 31 enlisted men were killed in action, 22 officers and 180 more enlisted men were wounded, a casualty rate that reflected just how consistently the battalion found itself at the front rather than rotated to quieter sectors the way many units eventually were. Members of the battalion collectively received close to 300 Purple Hearts, along with roughly a dozen Silver Stars and dozens of Bronze Stars for individual acts of valor across the campaign. Decorations that, taken together, made the 761st one of the most highly decorated tank battalions of the entire war, independent tank unit or otherwise. 8 black enlisted men earned battlefield commissions during the fighting, a genuine rarity for the era, when opportunities for black soldiers to rise into the officer corps at all remained sharply limited across the rest of the Army. Commanders who fought alongside the 761st, including the commanding general of the 17th Airborne Division, later credited the battalion's tank support directly with saving the lives of large numbers of their own infantrymen, a level of respect the unit had to earn entirely through its own performance rather than receive by default. And yet, for decades after the war ended, the battalion's own government treated its record with something close to institutional indifference. It wasn't until 1978, more than 3 decades after the unit was deactivated, that the 761st finally received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest collective honor the Army can bestow, formally recognizing what the battalion's own commanders had already known in the field, that the Black Panthers had fought with a level of skill and courage that any unit in the Army would have been proud to claim. The delay in recognizing Ruben Rivers specifically became, in the years since, one of the more visible symbols of just how long that institutional indifference actually lasted, and how much it cost the men who deserved better while they were still alive to receive it. His Medal of Honor, awarded in 1997, arrived only after his family, his surviving comrades, and a formal government review had spent decades pushing for exactly the recognition Captain Williams had tried to secure for him within days of his death on that cold November morning. A monument to the entire battalion was eventually unveiled at Fort Hood, Texas, in 2005, attended by the dwindling number of surviving veterans still alive to see it. A stretch of highway running through Rivers' home county in Oklahoma was named in his honor in 2009. None of it reached the men who most deserved to see it, while they were still alive to appreciate it. The Black Panthers fought a war on two fronts simultaneously, in a way few other American units of the era had to. They fought the German army for 183 consecutive days across 6 countries, inflicting enormous cost on an enemy that never faced them without respect, regardless of what that same enemy's propaganda might have claimed about racial hierarchy. And they fought, for decades afterward, simply to have that record acknowledged by the same country that had trained them for 2 years before trusting them to fight at all, sent them into some of the war's hardest combat once that trust was finally extended, and then took more than 30 years to say so publicly, in any form more substantial than the private commendations of the officers who'd actually fought beside them. Ruben Rivers didn't live to see either fight resolved. The men who survived him did, eventually, just far later than any of them should have had to wait for a country they'd already proven, in blood, they were willing to fight for. If you want to hear the story of the Battle of the Bulge itself, the campaign the 761st fought through in some of the worst winter conditions of the entire war, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.